Imagine this. The smoke has cleared from the battlefields of the revolution. The taste of freedom is sweet, but also terrifying. 13 colonies, now 13 states, stand on the edge of a new world, but they are fragile, like a newborn foal on shaky legs. The war was won, but the peace was a terrifying, blank page. The real fight, the one for the soul of a nation, had just begun. This wasn't a kingdom, and it wasn't an empire. It was something new, an experiment. 13 different entities, each with its own interests, its own culture, its own pride. They were bound together by the shared trauma of war and the shared dream of liberty. But would that be enough to keep them from tearing each other apart? The old government, the Articles of Confederation, was failing. The country was drowning in debt. States were arguing over borders, and whispers of rebellion were starting to surface once more. The dream of America was on the verge of becoming a nightmare. In this moment of chaos and uncertainty, the people, from the farmers in Massachusetts to the merchants in Charleston, looked for a leader. Not a king, not a tyrant, but someone who could guide them through this storm. Their eyes turned to one man, a man who had already sacrificed so much. He had led them through the darkest days of the war, a steadfast general who refused to give up. He had famously given up power when he could have seized it, returning to his farm like a modern dozen. His name was George Washington. Washington was reluctant. He loved his quiet life at Mount Vernon, the rhythm of the seasons on his farm. He had done his duty, he thought, but the call of his country was a powerful one. Letters poured in. Friends and former comrades begged him to return. They saw in him the one person with the authority, the respect, and the integrity. To unite the fractured states, he was the indispensable man, the one figure everyone, from the fiery Alexander Hamilton to the thoughtful James Madison, could agree on. And so, with a heavy heart but a resolute spirit, Washington once again answered the call. He journeyed to Philadelphia in the sweltering summer of 1787, not as a general, but as a delegate. The task before him and the other founding fathers was monumental. To forge a new government from scratch, one that could balance power, protect liberty, and ensure the survival of this fledgling republic. The Constitutional Convention began, a gathering of some of the most brilliant minds in the New World, all wrestling with the fundamental questions of governance. The debates were fierce. How much power should the central government have? How should the people be represented? What about the contentious issue of slavery, a dark stain that already threatened to unravel the Union? Small states feared being swallowed by large ones. Southern states worried about their agricultural economy. Through it all, Washington presided over the convention with a quiet, steadying presence. His authority wasn't in his words, but in his character. He was the anchor that kept the ship of state from being torn apart by the storms of debate. Out of this crucible of ideas, a new document emerged. The United States Constitution. It was a masterpiece of compromise, a blueprint for a government of the people, by the people. But a blueprint is just a piece of paper. It needed to be brought to life. And once again, the nation called upon George Washington. In 1789, he was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, the only one in history to receive every single electoral vote. His inauguration in New York City was a somber yet hopeful affair. Placing his hand on the Bible, he took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The weight of the world was on his shoulders. He had no precedent to follow, no tradition to guide him. Every decision he made, from creating the first cabinet to establishing presidential etiquette, would set the course for generations to come. He was walking on untrodden ground, acutely aware that the future of the American experiment rested on his shoulders. The first years were a tightrope walk. Washington had to build a functioning government, establish financial stability, and navigate treacherous international waters. He surrounded himself with brilliant but contentious figures like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, whose opposing visions for the country created constant tension within his own cabinet. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian republic of independent farmers, while Hamilton pushed for a strong federal government and a robust industrial economy. Their clash of ideals represented the fundamental debate over what America should become. Washington acted as the great mediator, steering the nation between these competing visions. He supported Hamilton's plan to assume state debts and create a national bank, a controversial move that put the country on a firm financial footing but also fueled fears of an overreaching federal government. He also faced the first major test of federal authority with the Whiskey Rebellion, when farmers in western Pennsylvania protested attacks on whiskey. Washington didn't hesitate. He personally led troops to quell the uprising, demonstrating that the new government had the will and the power to enforce its laws. In foreign policy, he declared a policy of neutrality, skillfully keeping the young nation out of the escalating wars between France and Great Britain. This was a deeply unpopular decision for many who felt a debt to France for their help in the Revolution. But Washington knew that the fragile nation could not afford to be drawn into another European conflict. His primary goal was survival, giving the country time to grow, to strengthen, and to develop its own identity. After 2 terms, Washington did something truly revolutionary. He willingly stepped down from power. In his farewell address, a timeless document of political wisdom, he warned against the dangers of political factions and permanent foreign alliances. He urged his countrymen to cherish their union and to value public virtue. His peaceful transfer of power to John Adams established a precedent that has been the bedrock of American democracy ever since. He proved that the leader served the nation, not the other way around. The birth of the United States was not a single event, but a long, arduous process. It was a story of brave soldiers, brilliant thinkers, and bitter compromises. But at its heart, it was the story of a reluctant hero who answered his country's call not once, but twice. George Washington wasn't a perfect man, but he was the leader the nation needed. He provided the stability, integrity, and wisdom that allowed a fragile collection of states to grow into a unified republic. He was the father of his country, not because he willed it, but because he earned it, through his sacrifice, his leadership, and his unwavering commitment to the American experiment. The foundation he laid was strong, but the challenges to the young nation were far from over. Thank you so much for watching this first chapter in our series. If you found this journey into America's past as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. We have so much more to explore together. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're kicking off a brand new series, diving deep into the lives of figures who shaped our world. And who better to start with than the man on the dollar bill himself? But who Asterix was? Asterix George Washington, really, beyond the powdered wig and the stoic portraits. There lies a story far more complex and fascinating than you might remember from history class. Born in 1732, right here in colonial Virginia, George Washington's early life wasn't one of gilded palaces. He grew up on the fertile banks of the Potomac River, a world of dirt under his fingernails and the rhythm of the seasons. His family were landowners, part of the gentry, but his world was practical, grounded. He learned the land not just as a home, but as a science. His first real profession wasn't politics or war. It was as a surveyor. Think about that for a second. In his late teens, he was trekking through the wild, untamed backcountry of Virginia, mapping it out, defining its boundaries. This job required incredible precision, endurance, and a deep understanding of the landscape. It taught him how to read terrain, a skill that would prove absolutely invaluable later in his life. It also instilled in him a profound connection to the American land itself, a connection that would fuel his revolutionary fire. He wasn't just fighting for an idea. He was fighting for the very soil he had measured and charted. But life on the frontier was rough, and it quickly drew him into another role, that of a soldier. The mid-18th century was a tense time, with British and French forces vying for control of North America. Washington, a young officer in the Virginia militia, was thrust right into the heart of this conflict, which we now call the French and Indian War. His early military career was, frankly, a mixed bag. He made mistakes, some of them with serious consequences, like the skirmish at Jumonville Glen that helped ignite a global war. But he learned from every single one. He experienced the harsh realities of command, the challenges of leading ill-equipped and poorly trained men, and the brutal nature of wilderness warfare. He saw firsthand the arrogance of some British officers and the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics used by Native American tribes. These weren't lessons you could learn in a book. They were forged in the crucible of battle, shaping him from an ambitious young surveyor into a seasoned, resilient military leader. He was building a reputation not as an invincible general, but as a man who would not quit, a man who learned, adapted, and endured. After the war, Washington returned to his beloved Mount Vernon, not just as a farmer, but as an innovator. He wasn't content to just grow tobacco, the cash crop of the era. He saw it was depleting the soil. So, he experimented. He was one of the first in Virginia to pivot to wheat as a primary crop and designed a Statuvier 16-sided barn to process it more efficiently. He was obsessed with agricultural science, corresponding with experts in England, trying new plows, and practicing crop rotation. Mount Vernon became a model of agricultural innovation. He was a businessman, a manager, a man who understood systems and efficiency. This period between wars is crucial. It shows us a Washington who wasn't just waiting for history to call him. He was actively building, creating, and improving his own corner of the world. He was a man of action, a man of substance, grounded in the practical realities of making a living from the land. This deep-seated practicality and integrity would become the bedrock of his leadership. But the quiet life of a gentleman farmer was not to last. The relationship between the American colonies and Great Britain was souring. Taxes, regulations, a lack of representation. The grievances were piling up. Washington, as a prominent Virginian and a veteran, was naturally drawn into the political fray. He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and later as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He wasn't the most fiery orator. Men like Patrick Henry were far more eloquent. Washington's power was different. It was in his presence, his quiet gravitas, his reputation for unshakable integrity. When the delegates in Philadelphia looked for a man to lead their fledgling army against the most powerful military on earth, they didn't choose the best speaker or the most radical revolutionary. They chose the man they trusted. They chose George Washington. Imagine the weight of that moment. He was asked to lead a ragtag army of farmers and merchants against the British Empire. The odds were astronomically against them. Accepting the command was, in many ways, a death sentence. Yet, he accepted, famously refusing to take a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. This wasn't about fame or fortune for him. It was about duty. It was about a principle. He believed in the cause of American liberty, and he was willing to risk everything, his property, his reputation, his very life for it. This singular act tells you more about his character than any battle he would go on to win. He was a man who placed principle above personal gain, a quality that would inspire loyalty and devotion in the darkest hours of the Revolution. The Revolutionary War was an 8-year-long ordeal of hardship and near disaster. There were brutal winters at Valley Forge, humiliating defeats in New York, and moments when the entire cause seemed lost. Through it all, Washington was the glue that held the Continental Army together. His genius wasn't always in battlefield tactics, though he had his brilliant moments like the surprise attacks at Trenton and Princeton. His true genius was in leadership. It was in his sheer perseverance. He managed to keep an army in the field, underfunded, starving, and often on the brink of mutiny, through sheer force of will. He shared in their hardships, he earned their respect, and he never, ever gave up hope. He understood that his primary goal wasn't just to win battles, but to keep the army on the revolution itself alive. This resilience, this unwavering commitment in the face of overwhelming odds, is perhaps his greatest legacy as a general. When the war was finally won at Yorktown, Washington faced his most defining moment. With the army at his back and the country in disarray, some of his officers urged him to seize power and declare himself king. This was the historical norm. Victorious generals became rulers, but Washington did something truly revolutionary. He said no. He went before Congress, resigned his commission, and simply went home to Mount Vernon. This act stunned the world. King George III himself reportedly said that if Washington did this, he would be the greatest man in the world. By willingly giving up power, Washington cemented the principle that in this new republic, the military would be subordinate to civilian rule. He proved that the revolution wasn't fought to replace one tyrant with another, but to create a government of the people. It was an act of profound integrity that secured the future of American democracy before it had even truly begun. But retirement didn't last long. The new nation, governed by the weak Articles of Confederation, was falling apart. So, once again, his country called. He presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787, lending his immense prestige to the difficult process of forging a new, stronger government. And when that new constitution was ratified, there was only one choice for the nation's first president. Reluctantly, he accepted, feeling once more the call of duty. As president, he wasn't just a leader. He was a precedent setter. Every action he took, from forming a cabinet to delivering a farewell address, would shape the future of the office. He navigated foreign entanglements, quelled domestic rebellion, and worked to unite a deeply divided nation. He was keenly aware that he was walking on untrodden ground, and that the future of the Republic depended on his steadiness and wisdom. After 2 terms, Washington did what was still unthinkable in the 18th century. He voluntarily walked away from power. Again, his farewell address is a masterclass in political wisdom, warning against political factions and foreign entanglements, advice that still resonates today. He returned to Mount Vernon for the final time, a citizen once again, reinforcing the principle of a peaceful transfer of power. George Washington wasn't a perfect man. He was a product of his time, and his ownership of enslaved people is a painful and undeniable part of his story that we must confront and understand. But he was also a man who, at several crucial moments, made choices that put the good of his country above his own. He was a surveyor, a soldier, a farmer, a statesman, and a leader who guided a fragile nation through its birth. His character, forged by a life of discipline, duty, and integrity, truly did shape his destiny and the destiny of a nation. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gave you a new perspective on the man behind the myth. What part of Washington's life do you find most interesting? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. In our last chapter, we saw a young George Washington honing his skills and character in the wilderness and on the early battlefields. Today, we dive into the crucible of revolution, where the man becomes a legend. This is Chapter 3, The Revolutionary Hero. The year is 1775. The air across the 30 colonies crackles with defiance. The shots at Lexington and Concord have been fired, and the Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia, facing a monumental task: to forge an army from a patchwork of militias and farmers, and to choose a leader capable of facing the most powerful military on earth. The choice falls upon a tall, imposing Virginian planter. George Washington accepts the command of the newly formed Continental Army. He knows the odds are staggeringly against them. He's not just leading soldiers. He's carrying the very idea of a new nation on his shoulders. Washington arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to find not a disciplined army, but a chaotic assembly of impassioned volunteers. His first task is immense: to instill discipline, secure supplies, and create a fighting force from scratch. He faces a British army that is well-fed, well-trained, and supremely confident. The early days are a series of brutal lessons. The Battle of Long Island is a disaster, forcing a desperate, nighttime retreat across the East River. It's a moment that could have shattered the revolution, but in the face of defeat, Washington's true leadership begins to shine. He holds the fragile army together through sheer force of will, his calm demeanor a rock in a sea of panic. Think about the pressure. Every loss, every desertion, every shivering soldier is a weight on his shoulders. Lesser men would have crumbled, but Washington possesses an incredible resilience. He understands that this war won't be won in a single, glorious battle. It will be a war of attrition, of survival. He just needs to keep the army in the field. He needs to keep the spirit of 76 alive. And then comes Christmas night, 1776. The cause is at its lowest. The army is dwindling, enlistments are about to expire, and morale is in the gutter. In a stroke of pure audacity, Washington decides to risk everything. He gathers his men on the banks of the icy Delaware River. The famous painting captures the drama, But imagine the reality. The freezing water, the driving sleet, the exhausted, poorly clothed men. They crossed the river in the dead of night and marched 9 miles to Trenton. They surprised the Hessian garrison, achieving a stunning and desperately needed victory. Just days later, he follows it up with another brilliant victory at Princeton. These weren't just military wins. They were a profound psychological boost. Washington showed his men, the British, and the world that the Continental Army was not finished. Hope, which had been flickering, was reignited. But the war is far from over. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge becomes a name synonymous with suffering and endurance. The army is decimated by cold, hunger, and disease. It's a living nightmare. Washington is there, living among his men, sharing their hardship. He relentlessly lobbies Congress for supplies, his letters pleading for the food and clothing his men so desperately need. It is during this frozen hell that Washington's leadership is truly forged. He doesn't just command. He inspires loyalty. He walks through the camp, offering words of encouragement, his presence a constant reminder that they are not abandoned. It's here that the bond between the general and his soldiers becomes unbreakable. They endure because he endures with them. Through the long years of war, Washington masterfully plays a strategic game of cat and mouse. He avoids a decisive, fatal blow from the main British army while striking at their weaknesses. He learns, he adapts, he perseveres. He faces not only the British, but also plots within his own ranks, like the Conway Cabal, a group of officers who scheme to replace him. Yet, he navigates these political minefields with a steady hand, his integrity and the loyalty of his men proving to be his greatest defense. He understands that the survival of the army is the survival of the revolution. Finally, in 1781, the opportunity he has been waiting for arrives. With crucial help from the French fleet and army, Washington sees a chance to trap the British General Cornwallis at a small Virginia port town called Yorktown. In a masterpiece of strategic coordination, he marches his army south with incredible speed and secrecy, surrounding the British by land while the French Navy blockades them by sea. The siege of Yorktown begins. After weeks of relentless bombardment, the British, with no hope of escape or reinforcement, are forced to surrender. The world is turned upside down. A colonial army, led by a Virginian planter, has defeated the mighty British Empire. The war is effectively over. Now we come to one of the most defining moments in Washington's life, and perhaps in all of American history. The year is 1783. The war is won. The Treaty of Paris is signed. The United States is officially independent. But the new nation is fragile, and the army, unpaid and restless, is a potential threat. Some of his officers, in what's known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, suggest that Washington should use the army to seize power, to become a king or a military dictator. It's a path many victorious generals in history have taken. The prize is his for the taking. Washington is appalled. He gathers his officers at Newburgh. He gives a speech, appealing to their sense of honor and patriotism, urging them to put their faith in the new civilian government. As he begins to read a letter from Congress, he fumbles in his pocket and pulls out a new pair of spectacles. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In that simple, human moment, the tension in the room breaks. The hardened officers are moved to tears, their anger melting away. The conspiracy collapses. Washington has saved the Republic from its own army. A few months later, in Annapolis, Washington formally resigns his commission before the Continental Congress. He voluntarily relinquishes all of his power and returns to his farm at Mount Vernon. This act is absolutely revolutionary. In an age of kings and emperors, the victorious general simply goes home. King George III himself is reported to have said that if Washington did this, he would be the greatest man in the world. And he did. He refused to be a king, choosing instead to be a citizen. It was this ultimate act of service, this rejection of power, that cemented his legacy, not just as a great general, but as the embodiment of the new republic's ideals. He had led a revolution, not to gain power for himself, but to secure liberty for his people. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. Washington's journey as the revolutionary hero is a testament to resilience, integrity, and the radical idea that power should come from the consent of the governed, not the point of a sword. In our next chapter, we'll see how this reluctant hero is called back from his farm to lead the nation once more, this time as its first president. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of our story. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the life of George Washington. When we last left him, the cannons had fallen silent, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the American Revolution was won. For Washington, it was the end of a long, arduous journey. Or so he thought. After 8 years of war, all Washington wanted was to return to the quiet life of a gentleman farmer at his beloved Mount Vernon. Imagine the relief he must have felt, trading the weight of command for the familiar feel of the Virginian soil. He envisioned his days filled with tending to his crops, managing his estate, and finally enjoying the peace he had fought so hard to secure. He wrote 2 friends, expressing his profound desire to move gently down the stream of life until I sleep with my fathers. His public service, he was convinced, was complete. He had led the army, defeated a global superpower, and secured independence. Surely, he had earned his rest. But the new nation was like a ship without a rudder. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing document, were proving disastrously weak. The central government had no power to taxes, no ability to regulate commerce between the states, and no means to enforce its own laws. States were bickering over borders, printing their own money, and acting more like 13 separate, squabbling countries than a unified nation. The economy was in shambles, and the ghosts of war debts loomed large. Anarchy seemed a genuine threat. The dream of a united republic was in danger of dissolving before it had even truly begun. Leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton saw the writing on the wall. They knew that without a stronger, more stable government, everything they had fought for would be lost. A convention was called in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. But who could possibly preside over such a contentious gathering? Who possessed the universal respect and authority to bring these disparate factions together? There was only one answer: George Washington. At first, Washington hesitated. He was genuinely reluctant. He was 55 years old, plagued by rheumatism and content in his retirement. He feared that re-entering public life would tarnish the reputation he had so carefully built. What if the convention failed? He would be associated with its failure. He wrote of his unwillingness to be drawn again into public life. He loved his country, but he had already given so much. Couldn't someone else take the lead this time? His friends and colleagues pleaded with him. They argued that his presence alone would lend the convention the legitimacy it desperately needed. Without him, many believed, the delegates might not even show up. His attendance wasn't just a request, it was a national necessity. They reminded him that the work of the revolution was not yet finished. Winning the war was only half the battle. Now, they had to win the peace. The future of liberty itself was at stake. Ultimately, Washington's profound sense of duty won out. It was a recurring theme in his life. When his country called, he answered, no matter the personal cost. He couldn't stand by and watch the fragile new nation crumble. So, with a heavy heart but a resolute spirit, he packed his bags, saddled his horse, and made the journey to Philadelphia. He was once again leaving his cherished Mount Vernon for the uncertain world of politics. When Washington arrived in Philadelphia, he was greeted as a hero. His presence immediately elevated the proceedings. The delegates, representing a wide range of interests and ideologies, unanimously elected him as president of the Constitutional Convention. From his chair, he presided over 4 long, hot months of intense debate. Though he spoke little during the formal sessions, his commanding presence was a constant, stabilizing force. He was the quiet anchor in a storm of argument, his silent authority urging the delegates toward compromise and common ground. His leadership was not about fiery speeches, but about creating an environment where a new form of government could be forged. He listened intently, offered quiet counsel, and lent his immense prestige to the difficult process of nation-building. The delegates were creating something entirely new, a republic on a scale never before seen. Washington was the indispensable man, the one figure everyone trusted. Finally, in September 1787, The Constitution of the United States was complete. It was a document of brilliant compromises, a blueprint for a government of the people, by people, for the people. As the last delegate signed the historic document, Benjamin Franklin, looking toward the president's chair, noted that he had often wondered whether the sun carved on its back was rising or setting. But now, he said, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Much of that optimism was due to the man who had guided the convention to its successful conclusion. With the Constitution signed, Washington once again returned to Mount Vernon, hoping, for a second time, that his public life was truly over. He had done his duty. He had helped create the framework for a lasting republic. But the country wasn't finished with him yet. The Constitution needed to be ratified by the states, and then a new government had to be formed. And that new government would need a leader. It would need a president. As the states debated and eventually ratified the Constitution, it became clear to everyone that there was only one person who could serve as the first president of the United States. Again, the call went out. Again, Washington was the unanimous choice. The electors from every single state cast their votes for him. It is a feat that has never been repeated in American history. The news reached him at Mount Vernon in April 1789. This time, his reluctance was even greater. He described his feelings on accepting the presidency as similar to a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. He was not seeking power. In fact, he dreaded it. He was keenly aware of the immense challenge ahead. He was stepping onto an untrodden field, with no precedent to guide him. Every action he took, every decision he made, would set the standard for all future presidents. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but, as always, his sense of duty was stronger than his personal desires. He wrote in his diary, I bade adieu to Mount Vernon, to private life, and to domestic felicity, and with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than I have words to express, set out for New York. He was embarking on the final, and perhaps most difficult, chapter of his public service. He was no longer just a general or a planter. He was to become the father of his country, the reluctant leader who would guide the United States through its first fragile years. He accepted the presidency not for glory or ambition, but because his country needed him. And for George Washington, that was the only reason that ever mattered. Join us next time as we explore Washington's presidency, a journey fraught with challenges as he worked to turn the words of the Constitution into a functioning, enduring reality. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey through the founding of the United States. Today, we're re-diving into a moment that is almost unimaginable in our modern political landscape. The nation's very first presidential election. The year is 1789. The ink on the new Constitution is barely dry, and the fledgling nation faces a monumental task: choosing its first leader. Imagine an election season without attack ads, without rallies, without candidates crisscrossing the country making promises. Imagine an election without bitter rivalries or partisan divides. It sounds like a political fairy tale, doesn't it? But in 1789, this was the reality. The nation wasn't looking for the most charismatic speaker or the most cunning political operator. They were looking for something far more fundamental, a bedrock of stability and integrity. And in the minds of the people and the electors, there was only one person who fit that description. From every corner of the newly formed Union, from Massachusetts to Georgia, a single name echoed: George Washington. He was the hero of the Revolution, the steady hand who had guided the Continental Army through its darkest days. He was Cincinnatus reborn, the farmer who had taken up the sword to defend his republic, and then willingly laid it down to return to his fields at Mount Vernon. This wasn't a campaign in any sense we would recognize. Washington didn't seek the office. In fact, he was reluctant. He enjoyed his life as a planter and was wary of the burdens of public service. In his letters, he expressed deep anxiety about taking on such a monumental role. He worried about his age, his health, and whether he could possibly live up to the immense expectations of the American people. He wrote of feeling like a culprit who was going to the place of his execution as he prepared to leave his beloved Mount Vernon for the temporary capital in New York City. This very reluctance was a key part of his appeal. The founding generation was deeply suspicious of power and ambition. They had just fought a war to overthrow a king, and the last thing they wanted was to install a new monarch of their own. They saw in Washington's hesitation not weakness, but virtue. It was proof that he wasn't driven by a lust for power or personal glory. His ambition was for the success of the Republic, not for himself. And so, when the electors cast their ballots, the result was unprecedented. Every single elector, from all 10 states that participated, cast one of their 2 votes for George Washington. It was a unanimous decision. There was no other guy. He wasn't just the winner. He was the only choice. John Adams, who received the second highest number of votes, became the vice president, as was the custom at the time. But the message from the nation was crystal clear. Washington was the indispensable man. This unanimous election was more than just a political victory. It was a powerful symbol of unity. In a time of deep uncertainty, when the very survival of the new nation was in question, the people rallied behind a leader they universally trusted. They saw in him a figure of immense moral authority, a living embodiment of Republican ideals. His presidency wasn't about pushing a partisan agenda. It was about establishing the norms and precedents that would guide the nation for centuries to come. He had to invent the presidency, step by step, from how a president should dress and entertain, to how the executive branch should interact with Congress and foreign powers. This first election set the stage for the American experiment. It demonstrated that a large, diverse republic could, in fact, unite behind a single leader without resorting to force or heredity. It was a quiet, deliberate, and profoundly hopeful beginning. The people had placed their trust not in a politician, but in a patriot. They didn't vote for a platform. They voted for a person of unimpeachable character, and in doing so, they gave their new government the one thing it needed most: legitimacy. The world watched, skeptical. Most believed the American Republic was doomed to fail, to collapse into chaos or tyranny, just like so many republics before it. But in the quiet consensus of 1789, in the unanimous call for a reluctant farmer to become a president, the United States took its first firm step toward defying those expectations and building a lasting nation. It was a moment defined not by the noise of competition, but by the quiet power of universal respect and trust. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our history. It's a story that reminds us of the foundations upon which this nation was built. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Start a narration, hello, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a scene so foundational it feels like it's etched in stone. Chapter 6, The Inauguration in New York City. Imagine the date, April 30th, 1789. The place is not Washington, D.C., as you might expect, but the bustling, vibrant heart of the nation's first capital, New York City. The air is thick with anticipation. After a long and arduous journey from his home at Mount Vernon, a journey where every town and village had turned out to hail him as a hero, George Washington has finally arrived to take on the role he never sought, but which a new nation desperately needed him to fill. The setting is Federal Hall, a grand building on Wall Street, freshly renovated for this very purpose. Thousands have gathered in the streets below, a sea of faces craning their necks, their voices a low hum of excitement. They are shopkeepers, merchants, soldiers, and families, all citizens of a new and fragile republic, waiting to witness the birth of its leadership. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was an experiment, a profound question mark hanging over the world's stage. Could a government of the people, beat the people for the people, truly work? The weight of that question rested heavily on the shoulders of one man. As the appointed hour approaches, Washington steps out onto the second-floor balcony. He is dressed not in a military uniform, a deliberate choice to show he is a civilian leader, but in a simple, American-made brown broadcloth suit. This detail is significant. It's a statement of humility and a nod to the burgeoning American industry. He is not a king ascending a throne. He is a citizen accepting a solemn duty. With him are key figures of the new government: John Adams, the vice president, and Robert Livingston, the Chancellor of New York, who will administer the oath. A hush falls over the massive crowd as a Bible, hastily borrowed from a nearby Masonic lodge, is brought forward and placed on a velvet cushion. This is the moment. Washington places his right hand upon the open Bible. His left hand rests over his heart. He looks out over the crowd, his expression described by witnesses as grave and deeply composed. You can almost feel the collective breath being held, the weight of history converging on this single point in time. Chancellor Livingston begins to administer the oath, his voice ringing out clearly. "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States." ... quotes. Washington repeats the words. His own voice, though known for its power, is described as steady but filled with a profound emotion, a slight tremor betraying the immense gravity of the commitment he is making. "And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." As he finishes the oath, a powerful tradition is born. It is said that Washington, unscripted, added the words, "So help me God," and leaned forward to kiss the Bible. Whether this addition is historical fact or later legend, it captures the spirit of the moment, a profound appeal to divine providence for the future of the nation. Livingston then turns to the crowd below and proclaims, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." The silence shatters. An eruption of cheers, a joyous, thunderous roar, echoes through the canyons of Wall Street. Cannons fire a salute from the harbor. Church bells across the city begin to peal, and the crowd chants his name. The American presidency is born not in whispered decrees or royal proclamations, but in the full-throated, public celebration of its people. After the public oath, Washington withdrew inside to the Senate chamber to deliver his inaugural address. It wasn't a speech of triumphant boasts or political promises. Instead, it was a model of humility and Republican virtue. He spoke of his own anxieties about his inferior endowments for the monumental task ahead. He expressed his reluctance to accept the office and his faith in the almighty being who rules over the universe. He emphasized the responsibility of this first Congress, reminding them that the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps, as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. He was setting a precedent, not just for the presidency, but for the character of the nation's leadership, one rooted in service, responsibility, and a profound respect for the constitutional framework. This single day, April 30th, 1789, was the culmination of the revolution. It was the moment the theories and ideals debated in pamphlets and chambers were put into practice. The image of Washington on that balcony, hand on the Bible, taking that solemn oath, became the definitive symbol of a peaceful transfer of power, a concept that was revolutionary in itself. It established a ritual that has been repeated by every president since, a thread connecting the present directly back to that foundational moment in New York City. The cheers eventually faded, and the crowds dispersed, but the work was just beginning. Washington now faced the monumental task of building a functional government from scratch, navigating political rivalries, and setting the course for a nation still finding its footing. The celebration was over. The challenge had just begun. But on that spring day, on the balcony of Federal Hall, the American experiment took its first, firm, and hopeful step forward. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into one of America's most important moments. It's truly a story that gives you chills. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring the past with us, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so leave a comment below with your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine being the very first, the first to hold an office so powerful, so new, that every single move you make, every word you utter, carves the path for all who follow. That was the immense pressure, the incredible responsibility, faced by George Washington, the first President of the United States. Today, we're diving into how Washington, through his deliberate actions, established the very foundations of the American presidency. Welcome back to our series. In this chapter, we're exploring one of Washington's most enduring legacies, the precedents he set. Think about it. There was no handbook, no guide on how to be president. The Constitution provided a framework, but the day-to-day reality of the office, that was uncharted territory. Every decision, from how he should be addressed to how he should leave office, became a blueprint for the future. Let's start with something that seems simple today. His title. When Washington took office, Congress debated what to call him. Suggestions flew around, some sounding like they were straight out of European royalty. His Excellency, His Highness, the President of the United States of America, and protector of their liberties. Can you imagine? But Washington knew the new nation had just fought a war to escape the tyranny of a king. He wanted a title that conveyed respect, but rejected monarchical grandeur. He insisted on a simple, Republican form of address. Mr. President. Just 2 words, but they spoke volumes. They established that the leader of this new nation was a citizen, not a sovereign. It was a powerful statement about the nature of American democracy. Next, let's talk about the cabinet. The Constitution mentions executive departments, but it's vague on how the president should interact with their heads. Washington could have chosen to rule by decree, consulting no one. Instead, he created the cabinet, a group of advisors composed of the heads of the major departments: State, Treasury, and War. He regularly met with Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, seeking their counsel and debating policy. This wasn't required by law. It was a precedent he established. He understood that complex decisions required diverse perspectives and expertise. He created a model of collaborative leadership, a practice that every president since has followed. It showed that strength in a leader isn't about having all the answers, but about knowing how to find them. Washington's conduct in office also set a standard for personal integrity and public service. He was acutely aware that he was always on a public stage. He carried himself with dignity and reserve, carefully managing his public appearances to build respect for the new government. He knew that for the republic to survive, people needed to trust its institutions, and that trust began with the person at the top. He wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol of the nation itself. He hosted formal levees, or receptions, not as lavish parties, but as a way to make the presidency accessible yet respected. He was trying to strike a delicate balance between being a leader of the people and maintaining the authority of the office. But perhaps the most powerful precedent Washington ever set was his decision to step down. After serving 2 terms, he was still incredibly popular. Many Americans would have gladly made him president for life. But Washington had a different vision. He believed that the peaceful transfer of power was essential for the survival of the republic. In his farewell address, he warned against the dangers of political factions and long-term alliances. But his greatest message was in the act of leaving. By voluntarily relinquishing the most powerful office in the land, he shattered the old-world model of leaders clinging to power until death or defeat. He demonstrated that leadership in a democracy is temporary. It's a service, a trust given by the people, and one that must eventually be passed on. This 2-term tradition, as it became known, was so powerful that it held for nearly 150 years before being officially codified in the 22nd Amendment. Washington proved that a leader's true strength is not in accumulating power, but in knowing when to let it go. He showed the world that a nation could change its leader peacefully, based on the will of the people, not through inheritance or violence. It was a revolutionary concept, and it became a cornerstone of American democracy. So, when we look back at George Washington, we see more than just a general or a statesman. We see an architect. With every choice he made, from the title Mr. President to his voluntary retirement, he was laying the bricks and mortar of the American presidency. He understood that his actions would echo through generations. He wasn't just leading a country, he was teaching it how to lead itself. His precedents weren't just about rules. They were about character, service, and the fundamental belief that power ultimately belongs to the people. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts on Washington's legacy. We'll see you in the next video. Imagine this. The United States is brand new, a fragile experiment just a few years old. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry. And then, in the rugged hills of western Pennsylvania, a rebellion ignites, not against a king or a foreign power, but against the very government the people had just created. This is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, a crucial test that would define the power and authority of the young American Republic. So, why whiskey? Well, back in the 1790s, for farmers on the western frontier, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was money. Transporting bulky sacks of grain like rye and corn over the treacherous Appalachian Mountains was a logistical nightmare. It was expensive, slow, and often the grain would spoil before it ever reached the eastern markets. The solution, distil italiano. Farmers could turn their grain into whiskey, a product that was much easier to transport and far more profitable. A pack horse could carry the equivalent of 2 kegs of whiskey, which was worth way more than the single sack of grain it was made from. In many frontier communities, whiskey literally flowed like currency, used to barter for goods and pay for services. It was the economic lifeblood of the entire region. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton had a grand vision for America, a strong, centralized government with a robust national economy, respected on the world stage. But to achieve this, he needed to solve a massive problem. Debt. The Revolutionary War had been incredibly expensive, and the new nation was drowning in it. Hamilton's financial plan was ambitious. He proposed that the federal government assume the state's war debts, establish a national bank, and create a system to build national credit. To fund all this, he needed a steady stream of revenue. His solution: taxes. And one of his most controversial ideas was a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, which quickly became known as the whiskey tax. From Hamilton's perspective in the bustling cities of the East, this tax seemed perfectly logical. It was a tax on what he considered a luxury item, and it would generate the crucial funds the government desperately needed to pay its debts and establish its authority. He argued that it was a fair way to spread the tax burden and demonstrate the federal government's power to levy internal taxes, a power granted by the new Constitution. He believed that if the government couldn't enforce its own laws, the entire American experiment would fail before it even got started. For Hamilton, this wasn't just about money. It was about principle. It was about proving that the United States was a real, functioning nation. But back in western Pennsylvania, the farmers saw things very differently. To them, this wasn't a tax on a luxury. It was a tax on their livelihood. They felt targeted and misunderstood by a distant, powerful government that seemed to care little for their struggles. The tax was particularly burdensome because it was a flat tax, meaning small-scale distillers paid at a higher rate per gallon than large-scale producers in the East. Plus, it had to be paid in cash, a scarce commodity on the frontier where bartering with whiskey was common. If a farmer was accused of tax evasion, they had to travel hundreds of miles to a federal court in Philadelphia, an expensive and time-consuming journey they simply couldn't afford. It felt like history was repeating itself. They had just fought a war against a distant government imposing unfair taxes, and now their own government was doing the same thing. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed once again, this time through the Appalachian Hills. Tensions began to simmer, and soon they boiled over. Farmers started to protest. At first, the resistance was peaceful, with petitions and public meetings. But as their pleas went unanswered, the mood grew darker. Tax collectors were met with open hostility. They were tarred and feathered. Their homes were vandalized, and they were run out of town. The resistance organized, forming committees, and even raising liberty poles, a powerful symbol from the Revolutionary War. The rebels, many of them veterans of that war, saw themselves as patriots defending their rights against an overreaching government, just as they had against the British. The situation escalated until the summer of 1794, when a federal marshal arrived to serve writs to distillers who had not paid the tax. A violent confrontation erupted, leading to a shootout at the home of a tax inspector, and several people were killed. Soon, a militia of over 7,000 angry farmers was marching on Pittsburgh, threatening to burn the town to the ground. This was no longer a protest. It was an open rebellion. News of the armed uprising reached President George Washington in Philadelphia. This was the moment of truth for the new nation. Could the government enforce its laws? Would the Constitution hold? Washington and Hamilton knew they had to act decisively. If they allowed the rebellion to succeed, it would set a dangerous precedent, showing that any group unhappy with the law could simply take up arms and ignore it. The United States would crumble into a collection of feuding territories. Washington, determined to prevent this, decided to make a stand. He invoked the Militia Act, calling upon the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia to raise a federal army. And then, in a move that stunned everyone, President Washington did something extraordinary. He didn't just send the troops. He led them. The sitting president of the United States, the hero of the Revolution, put on his old military uniform and rode at the head of an army of nearly 13,000 men, a force larger than the one he had commanded for much of the Revolutionary War. His personal presence sent an unmistakable message. This was not a matter to be taken lightly. The full authority of the federal government, with its commander-in-chief at the forefront, was being brought to bear. This was a powerful display of federal power, meant to intimidate the rebels into submission without a major battle. As this massive federal army marched west over the mountains, word of its approach spread like wildfire through the rebel-held territory. The sheer size and organization of the force, combined with the presence of the legendary George Washington himself, had a profound effect. The rebellion's momentum evaporated. The once defiant farmers and militiamen saw the writing on the wall. They were no match for the might of the federal government. By the time the army arrived in western Pennsylvania, the rebellion had largely dissolved. The leaders had fled, and the followers had dispersed. There was no climactic battle, no glorious last stand. The army rounded up about 150 men suspected of being involved. A few were put on trial for treason, but most were later pardoned by Washington. The point had been made. The Whiskey Rebellion was over, but its impact would echo for generations. It was the first, and, in many ways, the most significant test of the new federal government's authority under the Constitution. It proved, once and for all, that the United States government had both the power and the will to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent opposition. Unlike the weak government under the Articles of Confederation, which had been helpless during Shays' Rebellion just a few years earlier, this new government could maintain order. The rebellion also deepened the growing political divide in the country. It solidified the support for Hamilton and his Federalist Party, who championed a strong national government. But it also fueled the opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who feared that the government's response was an example of federal overreach and a threat to individual liberties. This opposition would soon form the Democratic-Republican Party, creating the two-party system that defines American politics to this day. The Whiskey Rebellion, a conflict over attacks on whiskey, ended up being a defining moment that shaped the very character of the American nation. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into American history interesting, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video. Hello history lovers, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment in American history, a decision that could have shattered the young nation before it even had a chance to stand on its own 2 feet. The year is 1789. George Washington is president, and across the Atlantic, Europe is an absolute powder keg. The French Revolution has exploded, sending shockwaves across the continent and dragging nations into a whirlwind of war. Now, picture this. America is just a toddler on the world stage. We're broke from our own revolution. Our military is tiny, and our government is still finding its footing. But we have a treaty, a powerful bond with France, the very nation that helped us win our independence from Britain. So when France, now a republic, goes to war with Great Britain and its allies, they look to us. They expect our help. It seems like a simple choice, right? Honor the treaty. Help the friends who helped you. Many Americans, especially Thomas Jefferson and his supporters, felt exactly that way. They saw the French Revolution as a sister movement to our own fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The idea of abandoning France felt like a betrayal of our own ideals. Parades were held, French revolutionary songs were sung in the streets of Philadelphia, and the pressure on Washington was immense. To them, joining France was not just a legal obligation, but a moral one. But Washington, ever the pragmatist, saw things differently. He looked beyond the revolutionary fervor and saw the cold, hard reality. America was in no shape to fight another war, especially not against the colossal naval power of Great Britain. Our cities were coastal, vulnerable to blockade and attack. Our economy, heavily dependent on trade with Britain, would be crippled. A war could mean bankruptcy, the collapse of our government, and maybe even the end of the American experiment itself. This is where Washington made one of the most controversial and, arguably, wisest decisions of his presidency. He listened to the fiery debates in his cabinet, with Jefferson arguing for France and Alexander Hamilton arguing for neutrality. Hamilton pointed out that our treaty was with the French monarchy, which no longer existed. He stressed the economic disaster that would follow a war with Britain. Washington weighed the passion against the prudence, the idealism against the reality. In 1793, he made his move. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. It declared that the United States would be friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers and forbade American citizens from aiding either side. This was a bombshell. It infuriated the French and their American supporters. They called Washington a traitor, an aristocrat, a secret monarchist who was betraying the spirit of 1776. The French ambassador, a man named Edmund Charles Henn. They even tried to go over Washington's head, commissioning American privateers to attack British ships directly from U.S. ports, a blatant violation of neutrality. The Citizen Jeannette affair, as it became known, was a diplomatic crisis. Jeannette was openly defying the President of the United States on American soil. This forced Washington's hand. He demanded France recall Jeannette, proving that his neutrality policy had teeth. This wasn't about being anti-French or pro-British. It was about being pro-American. It was about survival. Washington understood that a nation's first duty is to its own people and its own preservation. This policy of neutrality wasn't easy. It led to Jay's Treaty with Britain in 1795, an agreement designed to settle lingering issues from the Revolution and avoid war. The treaty was deeply unpopular, seen by many as too favorable to the British. But again, Washington supported it because the alternative war was worse. He endured furious public criticism, but he held the line, believing that time was America's greatest ally. He knew that if the country could just have a few decades of peace, it could grow strong, populate its vast lands, and build its economy. And so we come to Washington's farewell address in 1796, one of the most important documents in American history. It wasn't a speech, but a letter to the American people. In it, he poured out his final advice, drawing from his 8 years of experience. The core message regarding foreign policy was crystal clear. Steer clear of permanent alliances. He warned against the dangers of becoming entangled in Europe's quarrels, their rivalries, and their wars. He argued that America's unique geographical position gave it the advantage of distance, an advantage it should not squander. He wasn't advocating for total isolation. He was fine with commercial relationships, trade with everyone. But political and military alliances, he saw them as chains that would inevitably drag the young nation into conflicts that were not its own, forcing it to spill American blood and treasure for the interests of others. This principle would become the bedrock of American foreign policy for over a century. Looking back, it's hard to overstate the importance of Washington's decision. By insisting on neutrality, he gave the United States the one thing it needed most: time. Time to grow, to heal the divisions within, to build a stable economy, and to develop a national identity. He chose the difficult, unpopular path of prudence over the passionate, popular path of ideological warfare. His decision didn't just spare the country from ruin it, preserve the very independence that had been so hard won. It was a masterclass in leadership, demonstrating that true strength sometimes lies not in rushing to a fight, but in having the wisdom to walk away. What do you think? Was Washington right to turn his back on our ally, France? Or should America have joined the fight for liberty in Europe, regardless of the cost? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history. We'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 12, Founding the Capital. After the fierce battles and political struggles of the Revolution, the new United States needed a home, a heart, a capital city that truly belonged to everyone. And who better to oversee this monumental task than the man who had led them to victory? George Washington himself. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of choosing an existing city like Philadelphia or New York, which might create jealousy and division among the states, a new federal district would be carved out. This wasn't just about laying bricks and paving roads. It was about building a powerful symbol. Washington envisioned a capital that belonged to no single state but to every American citizen, from the farmers of Georgia to the shipbuilders of Massa. It was to be the common ground, the very embodiment of e pluribus unum, out of many, one. The location chosen was a patch of land along the Potomac River, a spot Washington knew well and loved. It was a strategic compromise, situated between the northern and southern states. This decision itself was a masterstroke of political negotiation, balancing competing interests to keep the fragile Union together. Washington wasn't just a general, he was a nation builder, and every decision was a careful step toward a more perfect Union. He took a deeply personal interest in the project. This wasn't something to be delegated and forgotten. He appointed brilliant minds like Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-American military engineer, to design the city's layout. L'Enfant's vision was as grand as the nation's own aspirations. He planned a city of wide avenues, sweeping vistas, and monumental public squares, all arranged in a grid overlaid with grand diagonal boulevards. This design was intentional. The avenues, named after the states, would radiate from the key government buildings, symbolically connecting every part of the nation to its center. The Capitol building would sit majestically on a hill, overlooking the city, representing the power of the people. The President's House, later known as the White House, would stand with dignity, a home for the head of state. It was a city designed to inspire and a sense of national pride. Washington personally rode on horseback through the muddy fields and forests of the designated area, reviewing plans and making suggestions. He wanted the architecture to reflect the values of the new republic: strength, permanence, and classical virtue. That's why the buildings drew inspiration from the democracies of ancient Greece and Rome. Think of the columns, the domes, the stately symmetry. This was a deliberate choice to connect America to a long history of liberty and self-governance. He sought harmony and balance, not just in politics, but in the very stone and mortar of the Capitol. But building a city from scratch was an immense challenge. There were funding issues, political squabbles, and logistical nightmares. L'Enfant, while a genius, was also notoriously difficult to work with and was eventually dismissed. Yet, Washington persevered. He ensured the project continued, bringing in others like Andrew Ellicott and Benjamin Banneker, a brilliant, self-taught African-American astronomer and surveyor, to complete the plans. Banneker's contribution is a powerful story in itself. At a time when slavery was deeply entrenched, his role in mapping out the nation's capital was a testament to the fact that talent and intellect know no color. His precise astronomical calculations were crucial for establishing the district's boundaries. It's a poignant reminder of the complex and often contradictory realities of this founding era. As the 18th century drew to a close, the new city began to take shape. It was far from the grand metropolis we know today. Early visitors described it as a muddy, unfinished collection of buildings scattered across a vast landscape. But Washington saw beyond the construction sites and dirt roads. He saw the future. He saw a city where the great debates of the nation would unfold, where laws would be made, and where the collective will of the American people would find its voice. Even in his final years, Washington's thoughts were with the Capitol. He championed its development, believing that a magnificent and permanent seat of government was essential for the nation's stability and international prestige. He didn't live to see it fully realized. He passed away in 1799, just before the government officially moved there in 1800. But his vision was the foundation upon which everything was built. The city, named in his honor, stands as his final, most enduring monument. Washington, D.C. is more than just a place on a map. It is the physical manifestation of George Washington's unwavering belief in a unified American republic. In its grand avenues, its stately monuments, and its very existence, we see his search for harmony, balance, and a nation built to last. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the creation of America's capital. It's a story of vision, persistence, and the power of symbols. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in American history. A moment that wasn't a battle or a law, but a profound act of leadership and foresight. We've reached chapter 13 in the life of George Washington, the farewell address. Imagine the scene. It's 1796. The United States is still a young, fragile republic. George Washington, the man who led the Continental Army to victory and served as the nation's first president, is at the height of his power and popularity. Many Americans couldn't imagine a government without him at the helm. They wanted him to serve a third term, perhaps even to rule for life. The precedent for leaders holding power until their death was the norm throughout history. But Washington, ever the revolutionary, was about to do something truly radical. He was going to walk away. As his second term drew to a close, Washington made the firm decision to decline a third. This wasn't a decision born of fatigue, though he was certainly weary after decades of public service. It was a calculated, principled stand. He believed that the peaceful transfer of power was essential for the survival of the republic. By stepping down, he would prove that the office was more important than the man, and that the nation was governed by laws, not by individuals. This single act set a standard for American presidents that would last for over 140 years. But Washington didn't just quietly retire. He had one last lesson to impart to the nation he loved so dearly. He decided to publish a letter to the American people, a final piece of advice from their founding father. This document, which we now know as the farewell address, wasn't delivered as a grand speech before Congress. Instead, it was printed in the American Daily Advertiser, a Philadelphia newspaper, on September 19, 1796. This was a deliberate choice. He wanted to speak directly to the citizens, not just the politicians. He saw it as a conversation with the people he had served. The address itself is a masterclass in political wisdom and humility. It wasn't a speech about his own accomplishments or a boastful recounting of his victories. Instead, it was a heartfelt warning, a guide for future generations on how to navigate the treacherous waters of self-governance. He began by expressing his deep gratitude for the honor of serving the country and for the support the people had given him. But he quickly moved to the core of his message, the dangers that he saw on the horizon. His first major warning was against the spirit of party. Today, we are so accustomed to political parties that it's hard to imagine a system without them. But Washington saw them as a grave threat to national unity. He argued that the constant bickering and division between factions would distract the government from its duties, create unnecessary animosity among citizens, and open the door to foreign influence and corruption. He predicted that loyalty to a party could eventually become stronger than loyalty to the nation itself. He wrote that partisanship agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. Looking at the political landscape today, you have to admit, his words sound incredibly prophetic, don't they? He wasn't naive. He understood that political disagreements were natural, but he urged Americans to prioritize their shared identity as Americans above any party label. He believed that unity, what Akaed, the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, was the bedrock of the nation's security, prosperity, and liberty. Without it, he feared everything else would crumble. The second great warning in his address concerned foreign policy. This is perhaps the most famous part of the speech. Washington advised the young nation to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. This is often misquoted as a call for pure isolationism, but that's not quite right. He wasn't saying America should hide from the world. He supported good faith commercial relationships with all nations. What he warned against were foreign entanglements, binding political and military alliances that could drag the United States into European conflicts that had nothing to do with American interests. Think about the context. The U.S. was a small, relatively weak nation surrounded by the powerful empires of Britain, France, and Spain. Washington knew that getting tangled up in their centuries-old quarrels and wars could be fatal for the young republic. He believed America needed time to mature, to grow strong, and to develop its own distinct identity. His advice was pragmatic. Maintain neutrality. Trade with everyone, but commit to no one. This principle of avoiding permanent alliances became a cornerstone of American foreign policy for over a century, guiding the nation through a period of incredible growth and expansion. Beyond these two famous warnings, the address is filled with other gems of wisdom. Washington stressed the importance of religion and morality as the indispensable supports of political prosperity. He argued that a virtuous citizenry was essential for a functioning republic. He also emphasized the importance of public credit and fiscal responsibility, urging the government to avoid accumulating debt and to use it sparingly. He saw a large national debt as a burden being passed on to future generations, something he considered deeply unfair. What makes the farewell address so powerful is its tone. It's not the address of a king or a conqueror laying down the law. It's the humble, earnest advice of a parting friend, as he called himself. He spoke not from a position of power, but from a place of deep concern and affection for the country he helped create. He was offering his hard-won wisdom, not as a command, but as a recommendation for the solemn contemplation and frequent review of his fellow citizens. The impact of the farewell address was immediate and lasting. It was widely reprinted and read aloud at public gatherings across the country. For generations, it was required reading in schools, treated with a reverence almost equal to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It became a civic scripture, a touchstone for American political thought. Senators and presidents would quote from it to justify their policies, and ordinary citizens would look to it for guidance. Centuries later, Washington's words continue to echo. His warnings about political polarization and foreign entanglements feel more relevant now than ever before. We live in an age of intense partisan division, where political discourse is often filled with the animosity feared. We also live in a complex, interconnected world where the lines between domestic and foreign policy are increasingly blurred, and the debate over America's role in the world is constant. The farewell address reminds us that the challenges we face are not entirely new. The Founding Fathers, and Washington in particular, wrestled with these same fundamental questions. How do we maintain unity in a diverse society? How do we protect our nation's interests in a dangerous world? How do we ensure that our government remains accountable to the people? Washington's final act as a public figure was not to cling to power, but to give it up, and in doing so, to give his country a final, timeless gift. It was a gift of wisdom, a roadmap for the future, and a profound testament to his belief in the American people and their ability to govern themselves. It was the ultimate expression of his leadership not through command, but through humility, foresight, and an unshakable faith in the Republic. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Washington's farewell address. It's a document that truly deserves its place in history, and its lessons are as vital today as they were in 1796. What do you think is Washington's most important piece of advice for us today? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories from history. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we arrive at the final chapter in the public life of a man who shaped a nation. George Washington. After decades of service, first as a general and then as the first president, Washington finally laid down the burdens of office. The year was 1797, and his only desire was to return home, to his beloved Mount Vernon. For 8 long years, the presidency had kept him from the life he truly cherished. Now, the journey back to Virginia was a triumph in itself. All along the route, from Philadelphia to the Potomac, crowds gathered. They weren't just cheering for a president. They were celebrating a hero, a founding father returning to his roots. It was a heartfelt farewell, a nation's gratitude echoing through every town and village he passed. He was no longer President Washington. He was, once again, General Washington, the man who had led them to victory. Arriving at Mount Vernon must have felt like a dream. The familiar sight of the Potomac River, the sprawling fields, the grand mansion he had so carefully designed and expanded over the years, this was his sanctuary. He famously wrote to a friend, "I am once more seated under my own vine and fig tree, and hope to spend the remainder of my days in peaceful retirement." For Washington, this wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was the literal truth he had longed for. The weight of a nation was finally lifted from his shoulders. His days quickly fell into a comfortable, yet busy, rhythm. Washington was, at his core, a farmer and an innovator. He would rise before the sun, often by 4 in the morning. After a simple breakfast, he would be in his study, meticulously reviewing farm reports, planning crop rotations, and answering a mountain of correspondence. Letters poured in from all over the world, from old comrades in arms, political figures, and ordinary citizens. He answered many of them himself, his handwriting a familiar, steady script, sharing his thoughts on agriculture, politics, and life. By mid-morning, he would mount his horse, Nelson or another favorite, and ride out to inspect his 5 farms. This was not a leisurely tour. It was a hands-on management role. He rode 4 miles, sometimes covering 10 to 15 miles in a single day, overseeing every detail. He would check on the wheat fields, his prized crop, which he cultivated using advanced rotation methods. He'd inspect the grist mill, where his grain was ground into fine flour, and the distillery, a surprisingly profitable venture he started in his retirement. Washington was more than just a landowner. He was an agricultural scientist. He experimented constantly, testing new plows, different fertilizers, and innovative planting techniques. He was deeply concerned with soil conservation and sought to move away from the tobacco farming that had depleted so much of Virginia's land. He was a businessman, tracking his accounts with the same precision he had used to manage the Continental Army's meager supplies. This was his passion project, the work that truly fulfilled him. Life at Mount Vernon wasn't just about work, though. It was also a hub of hospitality. The Washingtons' home was rarely empty. Friends, family, former colleagues, and even curious strangers would make the pilgrimage to see the great man. Martha Washington, a gracious and tireless hostess, managed the constant stream of visitors. Dinners were lively affairs, filled with conversation about the state of the nation, the future of the Republic, and, of course, the latest news in farming. In these moments, visitors saw a different side of Washington. The stoic, reserved public figure gave way to a warm, engaging host. He would tell stories of the war, discuss his hopes for the country, and show genuine interest in the lives of his guests. He found immense joy in his family, especially in Martha's grandchildren, whom he had raised as his own. For the first time in decades, he was not a general or a president. He was simply a husband, a grandfather, and a friend. He was a man content in his own home. However, the shadows of public life were never far away. In 1798, tensions with France escalated, and the nation teetered on the brink of war. President John Adams, in a moment of crisis, turned to the one man he knew the entire country would trust. He appointed Washington, once again, as commander-in-chief of the armies. Though he accepted the commission out of a sense of duty, Washington did so with a heavy heart. He hoped he would never have to take the field again. Fortunately, diplomacy prevailed, and the crisis passed without him having to leave Mount Vernon. This final call to duty served as a poignant reminder of the life he had left behind and the peace he now cherished so deeply. He had given his all to his country, and his country had, in turn, given him its highest honors. But for Washington, the greatest prize was this: the quiet dignity of a private citizen, the freedom to walk his own fields, and the time to reflect on a life well lived. In these last 2 years, Washington solidified his legacy not as a man of power, but as a man of peace. He spent his days not on a battlefield or in a council chamber, but under the open sky of his Virginia home. It was here, at Mount Vernon, surrounded by family and the land he loved, that George Washington found his ultimate reward, a well-earned and peaceful retirement. He had guided a nation from its birth to its first steps, and now he could finally rest, content in the knowledge that his work was done. Thank you so much for joining us for this final chapter. It's been an honor to explore this incredible life with you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from history. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we arrive at a somber, yet profoundly significant moment in American history. the passing of George Washington and the immense wave of grief that swept across the young nation. This is Chapter 15. Washington's death and national mourning. As the 18th century drew to a close, a chill deeper than the winter air settled over the United States. In December of 1799, the man who had been the bedrock of the Republic, general, president, and father of his country, George Washington, passed away quietly at his beloved home, Mount Vernon. The news of his death didn't travel by internet or television. It moved slowly, by horse and by ship. But as it spread, it struck the heart of the nation with the force of a physical blow. Imagine a country that had only known one true, unifying figure. From the darkest days of the Revolutionary War to the uncertain first steps of the presidency, Washington had been the constant. He was more than a leader. He was a symbol of the nation's struggle, its victory, and its enduring hope for a brighter future. His steady hand had guided them through revolution and the creation of a government. For many, he was the only leader they had ever truly trusted. The reaction to his death was immediate and overwhelming. This wasn't just the passing of a former president. It felt like the loss of a patriarch. Across the fledgling United States, from the bustling port cities of the North to the rural farmlands of the South, a spontaneous and unified expression of mourning began. In Philadelphia, the temporary capital, the news arrived and plunged the city into silence, then into sorrow. Congress immediately adjourned. Representative John Marshall, who would later become the great Chief Justice, announced the news to the House, his voice trembling with emotion. It was here that Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee delivered his now famous eulogy, coining the immortal phrase that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a sentiment felt in every corner of the land. All across America, church bells began to toll, not for an hour, but for days on end. Their somber metallic ringing became the soundtrack of the nation's grief. In cities and small towns alike, businesses closed their doors. People gathered in the streets, not in celebration or protest, but in shared sorrow. Strangers comforted one another, united by a common sense of loss. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe people weeping openly in public, unashamed of their tears for the man who had been their protector. The mourning was deeply personal. People wore black armbands, ribbons, and cockades for months. Portraits of Washington, draped in black crepe, appeared in windows of homes and public buildings. Mock funerals and processions were held in countless communities, allowing citizens who could not attend the actual service at Mount Vernon to pay their respects. These events were attended by thousands, who marched in solemn silence to honor the fallen hero. It's hard for us to grasp the magnitude of this today. Washington was the living embodiment of the Republic. His integrity was seen as the moral compass of the nation. He had twice walked away from absolute power, first as commander of the Continental Army, and second after 2 terms as president, setting a precedent for civilian leadership that was almost unheard of in the world at that time. He had demonstrated that power could be held with humility and relinquished for the greater good. This is why his death was so terrifying for many. It wasn't just sadness. It was fear. Could the nation, this fragile experiment in democracy, survive without him? Would the political divisions that he had warned against in his farewell address now tear the country apart? He had been the one figure who could stand above the partisan fray, a unifying force that commanded respect from all sides. Now, that anchor was gone. Newspapers, which were the primary source of information, were filled with eulogies, poems, and tributes. Their pages were bordered in thick black lines. Every writer, every poet, every clergyman seemed to be trying to find the words to capture the scale of the loss. They weren't just mourning a man. They were mourning the end of an era, heroic age of the nation's founding. The government declared a national day of mourning. President John Adams issued a proclamation, urging Americans to assemble in their places of worship to reflect on Washington's life and legacy. On that day, the nation prayed as one, from the grandest churches to the humblest meeting houses. Sermons were delivered that praised his virtue, his leadership, and his unwavering commitment to the American cause. Even internationally, the news of Washington's death was met with respect and admiration. In Britain, the very nation he had defeated, the Royal Navy lowered its flags to In France, Napoleon Bonaparte, then first consul, ordered a 10-day period of mourning. The world recognized that a truly great figure had departed from the stage. Washington's funeral at Mount Vernon was a private, military affair, as he had wished. He was laid to rest in the family vault on his own property, the place he loved more than any other. But the national mourning continued long after. The collective grief served a crucial purpose. It reaffirmed the values that Washington was believed to represent: honor, integrity, and self-sacrifice. In mourning him, the American people were reminding themselves of the ideals upon which their nation was founded. The death of George Washington marked a critical turning point. The founding father was gone, and the country now had to prove it could stand on its own. The children of the Revolution had to become adults, carrying forward the legacy he had left them. The depth of the national mourning showed just how much he meant to them, and how deeply his principles were woven into the fabric of the American identity. He was their general, their president, their father, and their hope. And in his death, the nation he helped create was united, perhaps for the last time, in a single, heartfelt expression of love and loss. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of Washington's impact is a testament to the power of leadership and character. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical deep dive series. Today, we're exploring Chapter 16, the legacy of the first president, George Washington. It's impossible to overstate his impact. He wasn't just the first, he was the blueprint, the standard setter for one of the most powerful offices in the world. Every president who has walked the halls of the White House since has, in one way or another, been measured against the shadow of Washington. Let's start with the most revolutionary idea he championed: the peaceful transfer of power. After 2 terms, Washington willingly stepped down. Think about that for a moment. In an era dominated by monarchs and emperors who ruled for life, this was a radical act. He had the adoration of the people and the loyalty of the army. He could have easily declared himself a king, a ruler for life. But he chose not to. He chose to return to his farm at Mount Vernon, a private citizen. This single act demonstrated that in a republic, the office is greater than the individual. It established a precedent that has been the bedrock of American democracy for over 2 centuries, proving that power could be relinquished voluntarily for the greater good of the nation. Washington also showed the world that power could be exercised with gentleness and restraint. He was acutely aware that his every action would be scrutinized and would set a precedent. He meticulously crafted the image and function of the presidency. For example, he adopted the title Mr. President, a simple, respectful form of address, rejecting more grandiose titles like Your Highness that were proposed. This decision, seemingly small, was a profound statement about the nature of leadership in a republic. It signaled that the leader was a citizen among citizens, not a ruler above them. His approach was firm but not tyrannical, decisive but always considerate of the constitutional limits placed upon him. He showed that strength didn't need to come from an iron fist, but from moral authority and a deep respect for the rule of law. This brings us to his unwavering belief in moral leadership. Washington understood that the survival of this new, fragile democracy depended not just on laws and institutions, but on the virtue of its leaders and its people. He constantly spoke of integrity, honor, and civic duty. His own life, though not without its complexities and contradictions, was held up as an example of Republican virtue. He believed that a leader must be incorruptible, placing the public good above personal gain. In his farewell address, a timeless document of political wisdom, he warned against the dangers of political factions and urged his countrymen to cherish public credit and act with good faith towards all nations. He was essentially providing a moral compass for the country, arguing that its strength on the world stage would be derived from its character at home. This fusion of strength and morality became the aspirational model for American leadership. Washington's presidency was also a masterclass in nation building. He had to create a functioning government from scratch, based on a new and untested constitution. He established the first cabinet, bringing together brilliant but often conflicting minds like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. He skillfully navigated their intense rivalries, understanding that robust debate was essential for good governance. He oversaw the establishment of a national bank, a critical step in stabilizing the young nation's economy. When the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania, a direct challenge to federal authority, Washington personally led troops to quell the uprising. He didn't do this to crush his people, but to firmly establish that the laws passed by the federal government would be enforced. It was a demonstration of resolve that proved the new government wasn't as feeble as the one it replaced under the Articles of Confederation. He also had to define America's place in the world. When war broke out between France and Great Britain, there was immense pressure to join the conflict, particularly on the side of France, which had been a crucial ally during the Revolution. However, Washington wisely issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. He understood that the infant nation was too weak, too in debt, and too disunited to be drawn into a major European war. This decision was unpopular with many, but it was pragmatic and essential for the country's survival. It set a long-standing precedent for American foreign policy, emphasizing non-intervention and focusing on domestic stability and growth before engaging in foreign entanglements. It was another example of his foresight, prioritizing the long-term health of the nation over short-term passive. So, when we look back at Washington's legacy, we see more than just a general or a politician. We see an architect. He built the foundations of the American presidency and, by extension, the American government. He showed that executive power could be strong yet limited, that a leader could be respected without being feared, and that a nation's true strength lies in its commitment to democratic principles and moral virtue. He wasn't a perfect man, and modern scholarship rightly examines the more complex and troubling aspects of his life, including his ownership of enslaved people. But his contributions to the establishment of a stable, democratic republic are undeniable. He set a standard of leadership that was so high, so focused on duty and public service, that it continues to challenge and inspire leaders to this day. His greatest legacy is the nation itself, a republic that has, against all odds, endured. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of George Washington's incredible legacy. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series, where we delve into the minds of history's greatest figures. Today, we're on Chapter 17, exploring the profound lessons in leadership from a man who shaped a nation, George Washington. His was not a leadership of thunderous speeches or tyrannical commands, but one of quiet strength, profound humility, and unwavering service. It's a style of leadership that feels more relevant today than ever before. So, how did a Virginian planter become the bedrock upon which a new republic was built? Let's uncover the principles that made his leadership legendary. One of the most powerful lessons from Washington is leading by example. He didn't just issue orders from a comfortable tent. He was on the ground, with his men, sharing their hardships. Think of the brutal winter at Valley Forge. Morale was dangerously low. Soldiers were freezing, starving, and on the brink of desertion. Where was Washington? He was right there, in the thick of it, walking among the makeshift huts, offering words of encouragement, and ensuring his presence was a constant source of strength. He demonstrated that true leadership isn't about the title you hold, but the burdens you're willing to share. He understood that his actions spoke far louder than any decree. He showed his men that he would not ask them to endure anything he himself was not willing to face. This wasn't just a tactic, it was the core of his character. By enduring the same suffering, he forged a bond of loyalty and respect that no amount of pay or punishment could ever replicate. His example transformed a ragged group of rebels into a resilient army, united by a shared purpose and a leader they would follow anywhere. Another cornerstone of Washington's leadership was his commitment to leading without pride. In an era of kings and emperors, where power was synonymous with ego and opulence, Washington was a revolutionary anomaly. He consistently deflected praise and resisted the temptation of absolute power. The most stunning example of this is when he voluntarily resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1783. His officers, in what's known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, were on the verge of a military coup, demanding back pay and pensions from a weak Congress. They wanted Washington to lead them, perhaps even to become a king. But Washington rejected this path. In a deeply moving address, he appealed not to their ambition, but to their honor and patriotism. He famously put on a new pair of spectacles, remarking, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." This simple, human act of vulnerability disarmed the entire room. He showed them that service, not self-aggrandizement, was the true measure of a leader. His humility wasn't a sign of weakness. It was his greatest strength, earning him the trust of a nation and the admiration of the world. This humility was directly linked to another of his key principles: listening before acting. Washington was not an impulsive man. He was deliberate, methodical, and valued counsel from those around him. He established the concept of a council of war, where he would gather his generals and aides to debate strategy. He didn't surround himself with yes-men. He sought out diverse opinions, even from those who frequently disagreed with him, like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. He understood that the best decisions are rarely made in a vacuum. He would listen intently, weigh every argument, and absorb all available information before making a final judgment. Once he made a decision, astute be it, but the process was always collaborative. This practice of listening created an environment of mutual respect. His subordinates felt heard and valued, which fostered greater loyalty and more innovative thinking. It demonstrated that a leader's confidence isn't shown by having all the answers, but by having the wisdom to seek them out. He knew that the collective intelligence of the group was far more powerful than the genius of any single individual, including himself. Ultimately, all of these traits culminated in his unwavering belief in service above all else. For Washington, leadership was not a prize to be won, but a duty to be fulfilled. It was a temporary stewardship, a responsibility to the people and the ideals they fought for. Every major decision in his public life was guided by this principle. After the war, he could have retired to his beloved Mount Vernon, a celebrated hero. Instead, he answered the call to preside over the Constitutional Convention, lending his immense prestige to the difficult task of forging a new government. And then, he reluctantly accepted the presidency, not for personal glory, but because he felt it was his duty to guide the fledgling nation through its perilous first years. His 2 terms as president set the precedent for a peaceful transfer of power. When he stepped down, he proved that the republic was stronger than any single man. His famous farewell address wasn't a final command, but a parting gift of wisdom, warning against political factions and foreign entanglements. He saw himself as a servant of the republic, and his greatest ambition was to see it succeed without him. So what can we take away from Washington's example today? His leadership style offers a timeless blueprint. It teaches us that true influence comes from humility, not arrogance. It shows that the wisest leaders are often the best listeners, and it reminds us that the ultimate purpose of leadership is not to elevate oneself, but to uplift others and serve a cause greater than any single individual. His restraint is what made him legendary. In a world hungry for power, he chose to give it away. He proved that a leader's legacy isn't measured by what they gained, but by what they built and left behind for others. He didn't seek to be a ruler. He sought to be a citizen, and in doing so, George Washington gave the world a powerful and enduring lesson in leadership, that the greatest power lies not in command, but in service. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. The lessons from figures like Washington are not just for presidents and generals. They are for all of us in our daily lives. If you found this perspective valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. Your support helps us continue to explore these important stories. Let me know in the comments what you think is Washington's most important leadership trait. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. Friends, history is filled with moments that could have gone either way. Pivotal, razor's edge decisions, where a single choice alters the destiny of millions. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most significant of these moments of choice, made by one man that defined the very soul of a new nation. This is the story of how George Washington could have been king, but chose to be president. Imagine the scene. The year is 1783. The Revolutionary War is over. America, battered but victorious, has thrown off the shackles of the British monarchy. The 13 colonies are now 13 states, bound together loosely by the Articles of Confederation. But the country is fragile, teetering on the brink of collapse. The economy is in shambles. The states are bickering, and the army, which had sacrificed so much, hasn't been paid. There's a real fear that everything they fought for could unravel. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, all eyes turned to one man, General George Washington. He wasn't just a military leader. He was the asterisk leader. He was the symbol of the revolution, the embodiment of American virtue and strength. To the soldiers and the citizens, he was more than a general. He was the father of their country. And in times of chaos, people look for a strong, singular leader. So, it's no surprise that a shocking proposal was made. In May of 1782, while camped at Newburgh, New York, Washington received a letter from one of his own officers, Colonel Louis Nicolay. The letter, now famously known as the Newburgh Letter, painted a grim picture of the new republic's instability. Nicolay argued that a Republican government was weak, and that the military, which had been so mistreated by Congress, deserved better. And then he made his bombshell suggestion that the army should make Washington a king. Let's pause and really consider the gravity of this. He was being offered a crown. He had the army's loyalty. The people revered him. The political structure was weak. If any person in history had a clear path to absolute power, it was George Washington at that moment. He could have reasoned that a monarchy was the only way to bring stability. After all, it was the system of government the world knew. Republics were seen as chaotic experiments, doomed to fail. He could have accepted, and history would have called it a necessity. The United States of America would have become the American monarchy, with King George I on the throne. The entire revolutionary experiment would have ended right there. But Washington's response to this offer is what truly makes him a giant of history. He didn't just decline. He reacted with visceral horror and repulsion. He wrote back to Nicolay immediately, and his words are powerful. He said, "Be assured, sir, no occurrence in the course of the war has given me more painful sensations than your information of there being such ideas existing in the army." He called the idea big with the greatest mischiefs that can befall my country. He was not tempted. He was not flattered. He was horrified. He saw the suggestion not as an opportunity, but as a betrayal of every single principle they had just fought and bled for. Think about the sheer force of character required for that. For 8 long years, he had led a grueling war against a king. The entire point was to establish a government of the people, beat the people for the people. To accept a crown would be to make a mockery of every soldier's sacrifice, including his own. He was being offered the very thing he had just defeated, and his rejection was absolute and immediate. This single decision, this unwavering commitment to Republican ideals, is what separated America from the old monarchies of Europe. In Europe, power was inherited. It was about bloodlines and divine right. Washington established a new precedent. Power in America would be granted by the consent of the governed, and it would be temporary. He was making it clear that the leader serves the country, not the other way around. Even after the Constitution was ratified and the new government was formed, the temptation remained. When Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789, people didn't know what to call him. Suggestions like His Excellency or His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties, were floated. These titles sound kingly, don't they? They reflect a people still struggling to shed the customs of monarchy. But Washington, ever mindful of the symbolism, insisted on the simple, humble title. Mr. President. Just that. Mr. President. It was a revolutionary statement. It communicated that he was a citizen, first and foremost, not a ruler elevated above his people. He was one of them, chosen to lead for a time, but not to reign. He served 2 terms as president, and then he did something just as radical as refusing a crown. He voluntarily gave up power. Will get away. In his farewell address, he warned against the dangers of political factions and long-term alliances, but the most powerful message was in the act itself. He was demonstrating that power was not a personal possession. He was showing the world, and his own countrymen, how a peaceful transfer of power was supposed to work. This set a precedent that has been the bedrock of American democracy for over 2 centuries. King George III of England, the very monarch Washington had defeated, reportedly said that if Washington voluntarily relinquished power, he will be the greatest man in the world. And that's exactly what he did. So when we look back at chapter 18, a man above politics, we're looking at the birth of the American identity. Washington's choice was not just a political one, it was a moral one. He had the opportunity to gain ultimate power, the kind of power that men have killed for throughout all of human history. But his vision was greater than his own ambition. He chose to be a citizen. He chose to be a president, and in doing so, he gave America its greatest gift. A future free from kings. A future where the people, and not a monarch, would be sovereign. That single, profound decision is why we are a republic today. And it's a legacy that continues to inspire not just Americans, but people all over the world who yearn for freedom. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a pivotal moment in history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about Washington's choice. We'll see ya in the next video. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the legacy of a figure we see every day, but maybe don't always asterisk. See? Asterisk? His face is on the $1 bill, his name is on our nation's capital, and his monuments pierce the sky. But what is the true, living legacy of George Washington? It's something far more profound than stone or paper. It's an idea, an action, and it shaped the world we live in today. Let's travel back to the late 18th century. The American Revolution is one. A new nation, born from ideals of liberty and self-governance, is taking its first fragile steps. The world is watching skeptically. History was a graveyard of failed republics, movements that started with noble intentions, but ended with a strong man, a king, a dictator, seizing power for life. Many assumed America would be no different, and if anyone was going to be that strong man, all eyes were on General Washington. He was the hero of the Revolution, adored by the people, and commander of the army. He had the power, the popularity, and the opportunity to become America's first king. King George, the first of America. It has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? In fact, that's what King George III of England expected him to do. But Washington did something truly revolutionary. He resigned. In December 1783, at the Maryland State House in Annapolis, he voluntarily stood before the Continental Congress and gave back his military commission. He relinquished command of the army and returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, desiring only to live as a private citizen. This single act was a thunderclap that echoed across the globe. It was almost unheard of. Powerful men didn't just give up power. They held on to it, they consolidated it, they passed it to their sons. Washington's resignation signaled that the American experiment was different. The power resided not in a single man, but in the rule of law and the will of the people. This was Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer who became a dictator to save the Republic and then returned to his plow. But this was real. Of course, his retirement didn't last. The new nation was struggling under the Articles of Confederation. It was weak, disorganized, and failing. So, Washington was called upon again, this time to preside over the Constitutional Convention in 1787. His presence lent legitimacy to the proceedings, reassuring the public that this gathering wasn't a conspiracy to create a new tyranny. After the Constitution was ratified, he was the unanimous and obvious choice for the first president of the United States. He accepted, not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. He knew that everything he did would set a precedent for generations to come. He was, as he wrote, walking on untrodden ground. As president, he carefully navigated the challenges of building a functional government. He established a cabinet, asserted federal authority during events like the Whiskey Rebellion, and steered the nation away from getting entangled in European wars. He was shaping the very office of the presidency with every decision, but the most important precedent was yet to come. After 2 terms, Washington was still immensely popular. Many people wanted him to serve for life. The Constitution didn't yet have term limits. Again, the temptation was there. The path to permanent power was open, and again, Washington chose a different route. He decided to step down. In 1796, he published his farewell address, a letter to the American people. In it, he offered his parting advice, warning against political factionalism and foreign entanglements. But the most powerful message of the address wasn't in its words, but in its very existence. It was a formal announcement that he was leaving office, voluntarily. This is the core of his legacy, the peaceful transfer of power. When John Adams was inaugurated as the second president in 1797, and George Washington simply became a private citizen again, it was a moment that solidified the foundation of the Republic. It demonstrated that the office was more important than the individual holding it. It proved that the nation was governed by laws, not by men. This peaceful, orderly transition from one leader to the next is something we often take for granted today. We see it as normal. But in the grand sweep of human history, it is a radical and fragile exception. Every time we have an election, every time a president leaves the White House and another enters, we are reenacting the precedent set by Washington. So, the next time you see his face on a dollar bill or hear his name, think beyond the monuments. Remember the man who was offered a crown and turned it down. Remember the general who gave up his army. Remember the president who walked away from the highest office in the land, not once, but twice. His true legacy isn't carved in stone. It's woven into the very fabric of our democracy. It lives in every peaceful transfer of power. In every moment, a leader steps aside with dignity, reminding us that in a true republic, the people are the ultimate sovereigns. That is the inheritance George Washington left us, and it's one we must cherish and protect. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. As twilight descends upon Mount Vernon, casting long shadows across the rolling hills and the gentle Potomac, a profound stillness settles over the estate. It's in this quiet, reflective hour that we can truly feel the weight of history and the enduring presence of the man who called this place home. George Washington. This isn't just land in a house. It's the final chapter in the story of a man who became, against all odds, the father of his country. Tonight, we're not just recounting battles or political maneuvers. We're stepping into the quiet moments, the spaces between the grand events, to understand the heart of the man who shaped a nation and then, remarkably, chose to walk away from its highest office, returning to the life of a farmer and a citizen. It's a story of power relinquished, of duty fulfilled, and of a legacy that whispers through the very trees he planted. Think about it. After leading a fledgling army through the brutal, seemingly hopeless years of the Revolutionary War, after presiding over the contentious birth of the Constitution, and after serving 2 terms as the first president of the United States, Washington possessed a level of influence and adoration that few in history have ever known. Many expected him to be a king, a leader for life. The world was watching, holding its breath, to see what this new kind of nation, this new kind of leader, would do. And what did he do? He went home. His farewell address wasn't just a political document. It was a deeply personal letter to the American people, a final piece of fatherly advice. He warned against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements, not as a president issuing decrees, but as a fellow citizen concerned for the future of the home they had all built together. He urged unity, virtue, and a government grounded in morality and law. His decision to step down was perhaps his most powerful act of leadership. It was a radical statement in the 18th century, an era of monarchs and lifetime rulers. By returning to Mount Vernon, he shattered the old world model of power. He demonstrated that in a republic, power is not owned. It is borrowed from the people. Leadership is a temporary trust, not a permanent throne. This single act established the precedent of a peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of American democracy that has been our strength for over 2 centuries. Let's walk, in our minds, through the quiet halls of his home. Here, he wasn't General Washington or President Washington. He was a husband, a stepfather, and a forward-thinking farmer. He was an innovator, constantly experimenting with new crops and agricultural techniques. He was a meticulous manager, overseeing his vast estate with the same attention to detail he brought to commanding an army. These grounds were his laboratory, his sanctuary, and his connection to the earth and the rhythm of the seasons. But to truly understand Washington, we must also confront the complexities and contradictions of his life. The man who fought for liberty was also a man of his time, an owner of enslaved people. This is a difficult, undeniable truth, that we cannot and should not ignore. His views on slavery evolved throughout his life, and in his will, he made the significant decision to free the enslaved people he owned upon his wife's death. This act, while falling short of the immediate justice we would demand today, was a final, personal step on a long and conflicted journey. It reminds us that our heroes are human, flawed and shaped by the world they inhabit, even as they work to reshape it. His story is a powerful lesson that a nation's journey toward its ideals like liberty and justice for all is often imperfect and ongoing. As the last light fades and the stars begin to appear over the Potomac, we can imagine Washington standing on his piazza, looking out at the country he helped create. What were his thoughts in those final years? Did he worry about the future of the fragile republic? Did he feel a sense of peace, knowing he had given his all? wrote, "I'd rather be on my farm than be emperor of the world." This wasn't just a clever phrase. It was the core of his identity. His ambition was not for personal glory, but for the success of the American experiment. He believed in a nation governed by laws, not by men. He believed in a citizenry capable of self-government. His strength was not in his commanding presence or his military genius alone, but in his unwavering character, his integrity, and his profound humility. This is the essence of what we mean when we call him the father of his country. A father guides, protects, and teaches. A father sets an example, and ultimately, a father knows when to step back and let his children find their own way, trusting in the principles he has instilled in them. Washington's final and greatest lesson was this: true leadership is about holding on to power. It's about knowing when and how to let it go. It's about building something that will outlast you. The enduring spirit of Washington is not found in marble statues or on the face of our currency. It's found in the quiet strength of our institutions, in the ideal of the citizen leader, and in the revolutionary idea that a nation can be guided by principles instead of being ruled by a single person. His example challenges every generation of Americans to live up to the promise of the republic he helped to found. As the night deepens over Mount Vernon, the story doesn't end. It continues in every citizen who participates in our democracy, in every leader who serves with humility, and in every debate we have about how to form a more perfect union. The whispers of history here at Mount Vernon are not just about the past. They are a living conversation with the present. They remind us that the work of freedom is never truly finished. George Washington's legacy is a quiet but powerful reminder that the greatest strength lies not in command, but in character, not in ruling others, but in empowering them to rule themselves. And as the moon reflects on the calm waters of the Potomac, it illuminates a timeless truth that the man who could have been a king chose instead to be something far greater, an American citizen. Thank you so much for joining me on this reflective journey through the life and legacy of George Washington. If you found this story as moving and important as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the figures and events that have shaped our world. Your support helps us continue to tell these vital stories. Until next time, take care.